Last night, Russia lost something that no amount of oil profits in the world can buy back. Just 15 kilometers from the Kremlin, the heart of Moscow's largest refinery was engulfed in flames. The facility known as ELOUAVT-6, the unit that transforms crude oil into gasoline and diesel in the first place, was burning right in the heart of Vladimir Putin's capital. And this is not the story of a single explosion. It is the story of an empire whose lifelines are being severed slowly, night after night. While Russian spokespeople were still talking about a successfully repelled attack, they did something that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. They began rationing fuel in their own capital, an energy superpower, rationing fuel to its own citizens. In the next few minutes, we'll show you why this one fire reveals more than 10 frontline reports combined, why a single number has become the most dangerous figure for the Kremlin, and why the world's richest resource-rich nation is currently bleeding to death from within without a single NATO tank crossing its border. To understand why Russia is sliding into this catastrophe, imagine a multi-billionaire, a man who brags about his immeasurable wealth in front of rolling cameras. But his entire fortune is locked in a single safe, and every night someone sneaks in and carries out another bundle of cash. This continues until the billionaire is forced to allocate a strict allowance to himself, his family, and his servants. That is exactly what Moscow is doing right now. And below we'll show you how it came to this. In the early morning of June 16th, 2026, a large-scale swarm of drones breached the airspace over the Russian capital. Verified footage analyzed by the OSINT group Nova Plus revealed the actual target, the Moscow oil refinery in the Kapotnya district, operated by the state-owned company Gazprom Neft. The column of smoke was visible for several kilometers. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed the strike that same day. This time he wrote the Moscow region had felt the range of Ukraine's long-range weapons. A refinery had been hit from a distance of 500 kilometers. According to Zelensky, the operation involved the Domestic Intelligence Service SBU, the Military Intelligence Service HUR, and the Unmanned Systems Forces. He added that it was a just response to the Russian attacks. The day before, Russia had launched a heavy barrage of missiles and drones at Kyiv. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin had to acknowledge the strike. On his Telegram channel, he wrote that around 60 drones had been intercepted as they approached the city, and that one of them had damaged a facility at the Moscow refinery. There were no casualties. The Russian Ministry of Defense stated that between 8 p.m. on June 15th and 7 a.m. on June 16th, a total of 172 drones were destroyed over Russian territory. What they failed to mention, a facility can catch fire even if just a single drone gets through. And here are the figures the Kremlin would prefer not to mention at all. The Moscow refinery is not just any facility. It supplies about 40% of the capital region's fuel market, roughly 70% of the gasoline consumed there, and half of the diesel as well as the kerosene for Moscow's airports. Its processing capacity is around 11 million metric tons of crude oil per year, making it one of the 10 largest refineries in Russia. The affected unit ELOUAVT-6 is the first stage of the entire production process, the point where it all begins. If this core component fails, the entire chain could potentially come to a standstill. The consequences were immediately visible in the skies over Moscow. The Russian Aviation Authority, Rosaviatsia, imposed emergency restrictions and brought operations at the region's 4 main airports to a standstill: Domodedovo, Sheremetyevo, Vnukovo, and Zhukovsky. A metropolis of over 12 million people saw its airspace partially shut down because Kyiv had targeted an industrial facility on the outskirts of the city. For hours, Mayor Sobyanin reported on the progress of the defense efforts. The number of intercepted drones continued to rise in his updates until 7:45 a.m. In the suburbs east of the capital, in places like Pavlovsky, Posad, Ramenskoye, and Zhukovsky, residents filmed the air defense strikes and the loud detonations in the night sky and shared the footage on social media. These were images that gradually eroded the official narrative of a fully protected capital. For what people witnessed was not a triumph of the defense, but a capital that had become a front line. But anyone who believes this was a one-time fluke is mistaken. The exact same refinery had already been hit on May 17th, which forced Gazprom to temporarily suspend operations at the time. The attack on June 16th was no exception, but rather another chapter in a campaign that Kyiv has been systematically waging since early 2024. The number of strikes against Russian refineries has doubled in 2026 alone. And the pattern is always the same. It's never about seizing territory. It's about the supply chain, the economic lifelines that keep Putin's war machine running and fill his coffers. Russian authorities insist that everything is under control and that the situation on the domestic fuel market is stable. But this is precisely the crucial point, which we will break down in a moment. For while spokespeople speak of stability, gas stations in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and dozens of regions tell a very different story. It is a pattern familiar to every dictatorship. Outwardly, strength is projected. Inwardly, cuts are made in secret. But numbers are harder to hide than words. And in this war, it is not a lost stretch of the front line that reveals the true situation, but the price display at an ordinary gas station on the outskirts of the capital. This story begins with a number that is a sheer humiliation for a self-proclaimed energy superpower. Let's turn to the first level, the most dangerous number in today's Russia, 20. 20 liters. Even before the strike on Moscow, gas station chains across the country had begun capping sales. The General Fueler chain set a limit of 20 liters per vehicle at more than 20 locations in and around Moscow. At Tatneft, a 20-liter limit also applied in Moscow and St. Petersburg for AI-92 and AI-95 gasoline. Other chains followed suit with limits ranging from 60 to 100 liters. According to estimates, 1 in 4 gas stations in Russia has now introduced restrictions spanning more than 70 regions, from Belgorod to Kursk and Rostov to Samara. The situation is worst in the annexed Crimea. There, gasoline is now dispensed only via coupons and QR codes, and kilometer-long lines form in front of gas stations. And here lies the real shock. When a state that sees itself as an energy superpower rations fuel to its own citizens as if in wartime, that is no mere technical detail. It is a public admission that the supply chain has broken down. A superpower that limits its drivers to 20 liters has already lost half the war over its own supply, and the shortages have long since reached the country's second largest city. In St. Petersburg's gas stations reported limits ranging from 50 to 95 liters after the Refinery in the Leningrad region was forced to shut down following drone strikes in early May. The AI-95 grade is particularly scarce, the gasoline, whose production was hit the hardest. At the same time, Moscow has tightened the screws. An export ban on gasoline is in effect until the end of July, and a ban on aviation jet fuel. Exports runs from early June through the end of November. A country that wanted to supply the entire world with energy is no longer allowed to sell its own products, because it barely has any left itself. Wholesale gasoline prices recorded their sharpest weekly increase since July 2025. But that's just the beginning. This brings us to the second level, the bill the Kremlin can no longer pay. Throughout the entire campaign, Ukrainian drones have carried out at least 158 strikes against refineries since 2022, hitting 24 of Russia's 33 largest facilities. According to industry estimates, the total damage to oil infrastructure exceeds $13 billion. About a quarter of the country's fuel production and roughly a third of its gasoline production have come to a standstill. Experts estimate that Russian refining capacity has already fallen to the level seen during the economic crisis of 2009. How this figure of $13 billion is arrived at is revealing in itself. According to a Russian insurance broker, the immediate physical damage to the oil and gas infrastructure amounts to over 100 billion rubles, roughly $1 billion. However, when lost production and consequential damages are factored in, the total impact rises to over 1 trillion rubles, precisely that figure of around $13 billion. And the strikes against Moscow are not isolated incidents. In mid-May, Kyiv launched over 600 drones in a single attack against the Russian capital and its surrounding areas. To achieve this depth of penetration, Ukrainian forces are estimated to be destroying up to 300 Russian air defense systems per month, thereby constantly creating new gaps in the defensive shield. The impact of these strikes has long been widespread. As early as mid-May, Western news agencies reported that nearly all major refineries in central Russia had been forced to scale back or completely halt production. The Black Sea Refinery and the Tuapse export terminal were struck multiple times within just a few weeks. Added to this is a psychological effect that further exacerbates the situation. Even reports of temporary shutdowns at individual facilities triggered panic buying and caused stock market prices to spike even higher. A market hoarding out of fear drains gas stations even faster than the production shortfall alone ever could. And now it's getting really expensive. The Institute for the Study of War, ISW, has calculated that in April 2026, Russia did indeed record tax revenues from oil production of around 917 billion rubles. But in the same month, the government had to pay out about 350 billion rubles, equivalent to about $4.7 billion in subsidies to oil companies to cap gasoline prices and repair the destroyed refineries. In other words, the profits flow in through the front door and right back out the back door. The ISW reaches a remarkable conclusion that turns every sanctions debate on its head. Strikes on Russian refineries are a more effective lever against the Russian economy than Western sanctions, because they immediately reduce the volume of processing and export. But before we move on to the third level, a quick reminder. You're currently watching Putin Final Act. We're giving you the full picture, not just the headlines, but the strategy and the numbers behind them. If you want to understand how this war will truly be decided, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to stay one step ahead of the situation. Now, on to the third level, which is perhaps the most bitter for Moscow. Why the world's most expensive air defense system couldn't save this facility. Vladimir Putin has concentrated virtually all major air defense and missile defense systems around the capital, forming a dense ring of radar stations and surface-to-air missiles. Serhiy Sternenko, an advisor to the Ukrainian defense minister, summed it up. Although Putin has relocated nearly all key systems to Moscow, that won't save the Russians. And here, we don't need to explain how a single drone works technically. What matters is the strategic math behind it. These calculations are ruthless. You can establish a defensive ring around the Kremlin, but you cannot establish such a ring around every refinery, every fuel depot, every pumping station, and every loading terminal in the world's largest country. Russia is bleeding twice over once from the destroyed value of the targeted facility, and a second time from the astronomical costs of shielding an entire capital city around the clock. Every drone built for a fraction of that sum forces the Kremlin to tie up many times that amount in money, missiles, and attention. This is asymmetric warfare in its purest form, and it is not playing out on the front lines, but in the defense budget's balance sheet. For every defense system that permanently guards Moscow is missing elsewhere over the refineries, the ports, the bridges, and the troops on the actual front lines. The Kremlin faces a decision it cannot win. If it defends the capital, it leaves the economy exposed. If it defends the economy, it leaves the symbol of power exposed. There are simply not enough expensive systems to protect both at the same time. But the real problem for Moscow lies one level deeper, which brings us to the fourth level, the war which simply grinds to a halt without fuel. For at the end of this chain of refineries, pumping stations, and fuel tankers are the tanks, trucks, and fighter jets on the front lines. Fuel is not just any commodity, it is the lifeblood of the war machine. This is precisely why Kyiv is deliberately targeting the very supply chain that keeps the Russian military mobile in the first place. And here a second weakness dramatically exacerbates the situation. Due to Western sanctions, Russia lacks imported spare parts to quickly repair damaged refineries. A hit facility, therefore, remains idle not for days, but often for weeks. Each new blow thus compounds the previous one, and the damage accumulates rather than being smoothed out. And this logic of severed arteries is felt not only deep in the hinterland, but also directly at the front. Since the spring, Kyiv has been systematically disrupting Russian supply routes in the occupied territories of Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. In effect, this has isolated the entire Crimean Peninsula because Moscow hardly dares to move equipment large troop concentrations or ships there without losing them. But when fuel runs short, an ironclad military rule applies. In an emergency, the army simply requisitions fuel from farmers' businesses and the civilian population. The fuel that was actually supposed to be sent to the tanks on the front lines is in an emergency taken from its own people. And the lines at gas stations are just the tip of the iceberg. But there is a fifth level, and it runs deeper than any refinery. Because in the end, it's not just about gasoline, but about the entire national budget that is funding this war. Before the war, oil and gas accounted for over 40% of Russia's government revenue. It is precisely this pillar that is now crumbling. To plug the growing hole, the Kremlin raised the value-added tax from 20 to 22% on January 1st, 2026, thereby reaching directly into the pockets of its own citizens. Inflation is eating away at the country, and fuel prices have risen by about 11% following damage to refineries. To stem this tide at all, the central bank is keeping the key interest rate at a crushing 16%, which makes loans for businesses nearly unaffordable and drives up corporate bankruptcies. And the most valuable part of this empire, its customer base, is dwindling away. Russia has permanently lost its most important customer, the European market, and is now dependent on China, which is mercilessly exploiting its bargaining power and forcing deep price cuts. Even India, long a major buyer, has reduced its share of Russian oil from around 40% in 2024 to about 25% by early 2026. So, the rich man is not only losing the money from his vault, but also the buyers who bring him that money in the first place. What does this mean for the big picture? That's exactly what we're going to look at now. What does all this mean for the grand struggle of this war? It means that Russia is rich on paper, but poor in reality. The war in the Middle East temporarily drove the oil price above $100 per barrel, and at first glance that filled Moscow's coffers. Oil taxes in April formally appeared to be twice as high as in the previous month, but the actual benefit evaporated almost entirely because subsidies and repair costs ate it up. And this is no outlier. According to calculations, every single month of the year, 2026 fell short of the Kremlin's own budget forecast. In March alone, there was a shortfall of over $3 billion. President Zelensky estimates Russian losses from Ukrainian strikes since the beginning of the year at least $7 billion. And this is precisely where Russia's desperation becomes apparent. A state that truly had no problems would not have to ban its exports or ration its citizens' supplies. It would not have to claim that everything is stable while lines wind around empty gas pumps in Crimea. The gap between the official narrative and the reality at the gas station has itself become a weapon. For every Russian driving home with 20 liters sees with their own eyes that the Kremlin's assurances no longer hold true. That is the real strategic message of June 16th. Kyiv isn't even trying to conquer Moscow with tanks. It is severing the economic arteries that finance and fuel this war, allowing the machine to slowly grind to a halt from within. And the next stage of escalation is already on the horizon. Analysts warn that as the year progresses, Kyiv will incorporate increasingly heavy missiles into this campaign, ones with far greater explosive power than a single drone. If these strikes continue at the current pace as the Russian winter approaches, and both heating and transportation simultaneously demand fuel, then today's bottleneck will turn into something far more dangerous. Even the Kremlin's bankers no longer believe in a rescue. The ISW noted that the windfall from the Iran war would not last, and Russia's own financial experts confirmed this. The country's largest bank expects the ruble to slide toward 90 per dollar as the year progresses. According to reports, a Russian official warned that a crisis could strike within 3 or 4 months, and the signs are already visible from restaurant closures to a growing number of mortgage defaults. This is the situation that a single burning industrial complex on the outskirts of Moscow is driving even further into crisis. Every blow brings this moment of truth a little closer. Now think back to that multi-billionaire from the beginning. He's still wearing his expensive tailored suit. On paper, he still owns an empire. But now he stands in front of his own, ATM enters his PIN, and only a single cold line appears on the screen. Behind him, night after night, the shelves of his vault are emptying one compartment after another. 24 out of 33 have already been broken into. And while he continues to smile for the cameras and speak of his immeasurable wealth, he's currently rationing his own family to just 20 units a day. The display reads, "Insufficient funds." That's exactly where Moscow stands tonight. The richest man in the room forced to ration his own supplies. If you want to understand how this war will truly be decided, subscribe to Putin Final Act and turn on the bell. See you next time.